We do have a department of music at Concordia.
Yeah,
and isolation rooms.
Yeah, yes. I don't know, maybe if there are some spare practice rooms going after the students sign up, I might try and sneak in.
You know, it's something that we talked about, but we could never quite get off the ground is like Sylvie Penner-Raymond in the dance department, she said about, I don't know, 15 years ago, they used to actually have kind of drop-in dance classes for non-dancers that she would just lead in the gym. And she said it was amazing. And then one of the music faculty, Liesland Adams, who retired not so long ago, would also have kind of drop-in, you know, singing for people who were just wanted to belt it out in their lunch hour. And yeah, it'd be nice to get that going again, something really casual for staff and faculty.
I just wanted to jump in to say it is 12:30. We would normally be starting now with a few welcome comments. Doug just disappeared because there is a technical difficulty. So all the attendees are here. They're waiting in a waiting room. We haven't let them in yet. So we are experiencing a slight delay. So the tech problems continue, but hopefully we'll get it sorted soon.
Hey, Heather, I didn't get to say hi to you, honey. How are you? Thanks for joining us here.
Yeah, thank you, Heather.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Very well. How are you?
Yeah, you know.
Such a hard question to answer these days.
No, it is.
Yeah. I don't really know how I am.
I'm going to go live to the attendees, and then we can begin, and I will work behind the scenes for things. Should be fine. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, welcome, and thank you for taking time to join us here at Virtual Four Space for a gently moderated conversation between Drs. Rebecca Duclos and Annie Guérin. This is a great moment for reflection, spirited and considered ideation, and something we surely all collectively need now more than ever: hope, vision, and inspiration. So Annie, welcome to Concordia, and thank you. Thanks to Rebecca and Maya for sharing your insights today. Attendees, hello. Thank you for joining us in such large numbers. We will do our best to attend to the questions that you share in the Q&A or in the Facebook live stream comments. Without further delay, introducing today's conversation and acting as moderator, it is my very great pleasure to welcome writer, researcher, artist, educator from Studio Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies at Concordia University, Dr. Maya Ray Oppenheimer. Over to you, Maya.
Hello, thank you for that lovely handoff, Anna. And hello, everybody. It's really nice to gather with you in this capacity. Thank you so much for joining us. Anna has taken away some of the things that I wanted to point out vis-a-vis who I am. I'd like to add to that I'm also a sister, a daughter, and an auntie. Amongst the various capacities that Anna already mentioned, my official title is Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Fine Arts here at Concordia University. I'm based across Studio Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies, and I think it's in that capacity that I was generously invited to be the moderator this afternoon. I have the pleasure and the privilege to work with a lot of students across the entire faculty. So it's nice to be present with some of you as existing students as well as incoming students. And something that we all have in common with myself, with Rebecca and Annie, and also with yourselves, is that we are members of a teaching and learning community. We often gather in a bricks and mortar site in downtown Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands. And as we start off this conversation, this hour together, I would like to take a few minutes to invite us all to think about where we're at. And that is across where we're at physically, where we're at intellectually, and of course, where we're at emotionally. We are not all located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. I am joining you from my studio space, which I'm lucky to have as part of my living space in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. But we're aware that many of you are joining us from other cities, other locations. But we are also joining from different headspaces and emotional capacities at the moment. COVID-19, of course, has been affecting what we have perceived to be an everyday. And in fact, it is resulting in us gathering through this interface, which is becoming increasingly familiar, but not always comfortable. So we are going to take the next hour as an open approach to having a conversation with you. My job as moderator is to not only support a conversation between Rebecca and Annie, but to also be a bridge between yourselves and Annie and Rebecca. So over the course of the following hour, we'd like to invite you to post questions through the chat, whether or not you're tuning in through the Zoom webinar or through Facebook Live. I also want to mention that we have a guest, Heather Gagnon, who works with student recruitment here in the Faculty of Fine Arts, who is going to help answer fields and take note of some of your questions that might fall outside of our conversation frame. Because we only have an hour together, we might not be able to get to all questions. So do know that she is there taking note, as are we. And this is one of many conversations that we'll be having together. I also want to circle back to where we're at in terms of how we're dealing with news cycles, how we're dealing with our plans of what it means to be a member of the learning community, what we're asking of that community, of ourselves, of our instructors and faculty members. And this is with specific reference to the ongoing and the spreading and the rising actions, demonstrations, protests, teaching, and calls for listening led by members of the Black community, by activists, by organizations, by allies in the queer community and those who intersect with the Black community. June being Pride Month, and there are already a lot of conversations going on around what that means. So this is affecting how we're gathering and certainly framing the kinds of questions that we're bringing not only to this discussion, but ongoing discussions with other peers and colleagues in the Concordia community. With this being said, I'd like to move to some introductions and to start not off in a particular fashion. One of my favorite ways to introduce colleagues is to kind of pass the buck of asking them to do it themselves, to find their own language with how they want to be in a space, to be in conversation. But in this particular moment, to also introduce oneself through something that they're reading. We are all, as members of a teaching and learning committee, or community, I should say, deeply committed to language and the possibilities of using language to communicate, to foster, and to share ideas. Yesterday was also Blackout Tuesday, a time in which many folks were taking stock of their allyships, their actions, and who they are uplifting in reading and learning. So in that note, I would like to perhaps start with you, Rebecca, as the outgoing dean of many years, not someone who by any means is leaving this learning and teaching community, but is shifting roles to the art history department. Would you like to please say a few words about where you're at and also what language you've been spending time with lately?
Gosh, where I'm in about 1,000 places at once, it seems right now, which I think is a nice way of entering into this conversation today. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have Annie and I in the same frame. It's been exceptional in my experience to have an incoming and an outgoing dean be colleagues and friends working together in the handoff. So it's a real pleasure to be able to do that. And what I hope in talking about what I'm reading right now is that maybe Annie and I can continue to stay in touch over this next year, especially by sharing some books together. It'd be nice to find a way to be together, but not always talking about work. And so on that note, you know, I know it sounds corny to say, but I'm actually learning how to read deeply again. One of many things I can say about a deanship is, as my husband often jokes, I read emails for a living. It's hard not to be in a realm where you can spend deep, concentrated time in others' languages. So I'm practicing, and it's felt just fantastic. There are a few silver linings to this COVID-19 situation, and one has been that I find myself having more time to read. And right now I'm reading some incredible short stories by Jane Bowles, who wrote very little, but wrote incredibly strongly and beautifully. She found writing a very difficult task, and every word is so perfectly, searingly placed that it's been a real pleasure to read those. Also Mavis Gallant from the 15th District. So I think short stories have definitely, carried me through. But on the other hand, I also read Pilgrim recently. I never read Timothy Findlay, I'm sorry to say, and I'm very excited to read more of his work. But I think the two books that I would feel most strongly about are one tiny one and one large one. The tiny one is a little book by a colleague, an ex-colleague of mine from the School of the Art Institute, Jesse Ball, who just wrote a book, a little, it's like 50 pages maybe. It's called Sleep, Death's Brother. And it's a book on how to do lucid dreaming. He used to teach a course in lucid dreaming where the students would actually sleep. So it's an amazing treatise on that practice as a liberation practice, actually. And then the big book is the Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. And if you can believe it, after many, many millennia, it's the first female translation of Homer's Odyssey. And I highly recommend it to everybody. And I think especially now in these times where we're all going through our own journeys, it's pertinent in ways that you just can't imagine how fresh this text is. So that's where my mind is and where my eyes are these days.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that reading list with us, Rebecca. I took some notes there. Annie, would you like to share your reading list and also where you're at?
Where I'm at, I'm in between right now, and it's kind of an interesting position to be at, exiting one job a few days ago and about to come into a different space, knowing that both of these spaces at this point are virtual. It's a slightly uncomfortable position. And I'm finding that I need to ground myself, and language, as you said, has always been really, really important and core to the way that I approach the world. Language in different ways, the books that we read, but also I'm somebody who lives in different languages. On a daily basis, I usually speak 3 languages. I've learned languages all of my life. I don't necessarily speak them, but I'm passionate about communication, but also the worlds that languages open to you, the different ways of framing things and concepts. So right now, I'm reading 2 books. Very different, but I think very related also. The first one is Slow Art by Arden Reed. I'd been wanting to read it for a while, and COVID kind of precipitated this purchase. Reed tries to trace the emergence over centuries of an aesthetic of stillness and of art that brings you into a state of contemplation. And he sees that as in response to the world's escalating rhythms. I found that particularly interesting reading in the moment of COVID because like everybody else, we spent a lot of time trying to adapt, changing the ways that we study, work, connect with people, and it's created all kinds of breakage or transformations in our daily rhythms. I've been focusing on that idea. I think that for many of us, with the confinement, our experience of time and our experience of space has changed tremendously. I haven't left my neighborhood in a few months now, which is driving me a little bit crazy. But because of all of this, I think that we're all craving a deep connection and a way to apprehend this new temporality that we're living in. The second book that I'm reading is actually a book about running. I've been a runner for 6 or 7 years now, and I love it. And I'm now reading a book by Sakyong Mifan called Running with the Mind to Meditation. And it's about mindfulness and again, rhythms and how to be really, really in the present through running, but also through other activities. So those are the things that I'm thinking about right now. And I think that this attention that I have right now to place and time and mindfulness is really about trying to figure out where I'm positioning myself in this in-between moment.
Thank you both for those contributions. I was writing down some key terms that were coming forth from your comments, and I'm picking up on themes of navigating change, navigating fissures, our changing experiences of space and togetherness and gathering, but also ideas of rhythm, and how these are all things that we bring into our personal, but also our professional practices. So it's very much a time of reflection. And to sort of share in kind, one of the things that I've been reading is some text by a colleague, Eunice Bellador, who is the director of the FOFA Gallery at Concordia University. And something that she's written has been going around on social media and is hosted on galerieweb.com, the on-site web gallery. It's called a pull-out supplement to semicolon, a white institution's guide for welcoming artists of color and their audiences, which is a response to a text by Fanny Sosa. And it strikes me that there is certainly, I wouldn't say new, but a rising call to thinking about inclusivity in institutional spaces. And you both have very particular experiences and perspectives with how that manifests in leadership, how that manifests in making connections, and by being someone who has the scope of a faculty. So with this next conversation section, it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what does a dean do? Maybe we can call this demystifying the deanship. I know that there are a lot of preconceived notions around what that position means. And for those of us who have been in the EV building where the dean's offices are, there's this kind of glass facade of the doors. And sometimes folks might pick up their pace a little bit when walking by, or maybe like look in and wonder what's happening in that office space, which is a really warm and welcoming one. So maybe we'll start with Rebecca as outgoing dean of the faculty, and then of course extend it to Annie as incoming dean, who has also been an interim dean at UQAM. What does the deanship position mean to you, especially in an institution in this moment?
It's such a good question. And maybe if I can, I'll try to start answering it with a story. About 5 years ago, I came to interview for this job, and I was coming from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which, as some of you might know, is a pretty radical art school in the States. And I was the graduate dean there, so that's slightly different. I mean, it's 700 students instead of almost 4,000. But and in the years that I was in Chicago, Dave, my husband, and I would actually host salons at our house. We had a big old rented apartment. Everything's big in Chicago, and we actually would just have about 100 students come once a month, and we would have open discussion topics, and people would be lying on the floor in the felt, and it was kind of like living in a commune. It was really wonderful. And so I was in that headspace, and I came to interview for this job. And I showed up at the appointed time, and it was in the board meeting room. If any of you've been there, I had never been in there before. So I patiently waited outside the door until I was called. And then they opened the door, and I walked into this room, and it's this huge long table that spreads across the whole room. And there were, it seemed like 20 people, probably about 15, but everybody's lined up against the wall. And there was one little chair on the other side of the table. And my first reaction was that I put my bag down and I walked to the other side of the table and shook everybody's hands, because it was just this moment where you feel so separated from this committee who you're about to have a very intense hour with, scouring all parts of what a deanship should be. And in that gesture, I could feel also all of them just visibly relaxing and taking a breath. And, I won't go on with the rest of the interview, but I will say that the next day they asked me to stay and come for another interview. And I told the then provost that I would do that on one condition, and that's if we change the seating plan. So if I can stay with that motif of changing the seating plan, at least very personally for me as a dean, that's what I've been trying to do over the past 5 years. And it has meant having a very different, very personal and very open style of, quote, leadership, and which is hard to do with a faculty the size that ours is. But I'm glad you mentioned space, Maya, because one of the things that we did right away was to start converting some of the spaces that were adjacent to the dean's office into public space, and taking back the architecture and opening it up and giving it back to students. And that was through the foyer program, that was with EV Junction, that is with, pop-up lounges, the Art Hive space. So, I think that one of the things that deans can try to do, we have power, but really it's kind of a small p power. And I'd love to hear Annie talk about this. I think being a dean in an arts-based faculty means that you learn how to work the edges, and you learn how to kind of break some rules. I hope, none of my senior administrators are watching this, but we tried to approach, or at least I tried to approach the deanship with my wonderful colleagues from a perspective of an artist. Of being unconventional in that way. So, there's so many other things I could say, but I think that the office of the deanship is in a funny place, because you're between senior administration and faculty, staff, and students, and it's kind of the dean sandwich where you're trying to please everybody. And that's impossible, but I think the best thing that we can do is to do everything that we try to do genuinely, and to do that from the heart. And to not just get stuck into this administrative hamster wheel. So yeah, that's one part of what I could say.
Thank you for that. I confess, Rebecca, you stole one of my jokes about being in a dean sandwich. I was thinking, oh, I'm the Maya filling in a dean sandwich. But yeah, this idea of opening up space and leading from the heart and balancing that with administration. Annie, has this been your experience also as interim dean at UQAM, and now thinking about how you will enter the Concordia position?
It's an interesting question, and I agree with everything that Rebecca has said. Actually, my experience has been very similar, even starting with the job interview. That was also my reflex to break the rule of going to sit at my assigned place and immediately going to shake hands with everybody. In my mind, because I was already part of the Montreal art community and university community, I was talking to colleagues. They were already my colleagues. And so it was an interview, and in the same way it wasn't. And they might have not have selected my candidacy. I didn't really care. I wanted to collaborate with these absolutely wonderful colleagues. You asked about some of the preconceptions that people have about the dean's office. A lot of people have asked me why I want to do this job. I'm a pretty passionate professor, teacher. I love my students. I love my research. I'm somebody who loves to work in archives and do field work and meet with artists. And that's been such a huge part of my life for, you know, many, many, many years. So people ask me, why would you want to take that boring, drab, solitary, bureaucratic job? And they also think that deans hold singular power, that we can change the course of events, and that we have this dictatorial kind of way of being. And the opposite is true. What I found working in the dean's office, first as associate dean of research and then as interim dean, is that absolutely everything is decided collectively and collegially. And I would say that in my experience, the best ideas have come from collective experience. So what I have discovered through this work is that it's actually really, really thought-provoking teamwork. And by team, I don't just mean the people in the dean's office. We work very, very closely with professors in all of the disciplines. We work a lot with students. If we're going to do the best we can for them, for their academic well-being, as well as their social and emotional well-being, we actually have to talk to them. And so we do that. When I was a much younger student, I wanted to be an ambassador. I wanted to travel the world and make connections with people and make things happen. And this is kind of how I see the dean's job, as that of a catalyst, as that of a facilitator, as somebody who sometimes has to forget themselves a little bit to buttress and empower other people, to advocate for the really amazing things that are happening, but also for the things that are being overlooked for all kinds of reasons. So that's how I understand that job.
Perhaps I'll take some of your comments forward, Annie, and bring in a question that has come from some of our students, specifically Andrea Yolanda, who sent in some questions born of a conversation with design students. And I'd like to envelop it with some context that brings in both of your backgrounds. It relates to dynamics in the classroom. And one does not just become dean. In fact, that's a position that is born of several ways of working and being in a teaching and learning community. And you've both been teachers and continue to teach. So I'll read this question that comes forward from Andre and his peers. How can classrooms be more mindful of students and teaching assistants' emotional needs? The question continues, what does investing in emotional intelligence, empathy, and humanity look like? This is a lot to jump in on. So Annie, please take it away.
It's a really, really great question. I unfortunately don't have an answer for it. But it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. You know, over the past few years, we've been talking regularly about how doctors need to train for empathy and for emotional intelligence, for example. But that extends to everyone who works with communities and individuals. We all need to be really mindful of people's emotional needs, of different abilities and different ways of relating, different ways of learning. Also. And that's particularly important now as the student body continues to diversify in terms of social and ethnic background, of course, but also gender diversity and others. So I don't have answers. I would say, though, that I'm seeing around me a lot of people who are making a lot of efforts and are putting a lot of thinking, actually, into changing the relationships between professors and students, and creating classroom situations that are more conducive to exchange and to empowerment. I mean, it's very, very, very different from when I was an undergrad student learning dates by heart and, you know, not being heard in the 80s and 90s. So I think there's a lot to do, but I think steps have started to happen. So I'm optimistic. And I think we can also learn from Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous pedagogy, from other forms of knowledge. And this is where actually the diversity in our student body, but also in our staff and faculty, will be a really great asset in the future years.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Annie is saying is spot on. I think I would even throw a little wrench in there to say, I don't know if the classroom can be all the things that we need it to be. And I think that's something that we all need to think about, is that, and we're lucky in the arts because we don't always spend all the time in the classroom. I mean, a lot of the work that we do happens in studios and rehearsal spaces, out on the street, in theaters, after hours, at night. And I think as we move forward in, you know, really complicated times, of course, the complication of this flat screen is another one that disallows a certain kind of, you know, collectivity to physically manifest itself. I think that we might want to start really breaking down and breaking up the curriculum to let ourselves continue to imagine that, quote, teaching and learning doesn't always have to happen in the four walls of the university. And I think we're phenomenally lucky in our faculty that we already have a predisposition to allowing that elasticity and that bending of space and that stretching of time, and that is actually respected and exalted the disappearance of the classroom walls. So I think those kinds of other spaces are where kind of more radical pedagogy can happen. And I think we need to keep expanding that and keep experimenting within these peripheral, or what we sometimes call para-curricular spaces that are outside the curriculum.
I'm interested in this suggestion or even reminder that you make, Rebecca, that the classroom is some things, but it isn't all things. It can be a crucible for discussing and thinking through and experimenting. And I wonder if both of you would feel welcome to discuss your decision to pursue a career in the arts. Is there something that you have found particular in the disciplines that this area of investigation and working and practicing offers fruitful for your development in critical thinking? Why pursue a career and commit a life to working with the arts and its peers and colleagues?
Annie, you want to take that one first?
Sure. It did not come immediately to me. I was an art late bloomer, one might say. My first university degree was a certificate in Russian studies. I couldn't choose what I wanted to do. I loved arts, but I also loved literature, history, sociology. I was and still am passionate about the ecology, gender issues, sustainable development, and all of these things. I just could not choose. And learning languages and cultures, in the case of Russian studies, was kind of a space that I found where I could actually bring all of these threads together. It's actually in the 1990s, I was living in Russia just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I, by accident, found a job in a museum, and I absolutely fell in love with that kind of work, but more than that, that's where actually I understood the role that art can play in society, and that's where it became really, really, really important to me. I understood at that moment in Russia that was facing this revolution, that art had a really important role to play in complex transformation, in creating language to think about the future, to understand the emotions, problem solving, understanding, reorganizing the worldview. And so that's what got me hooked. And since then, so I went back to university, started studying art history and other things. But since then, that's really what I'm particularly interested in my commitment as a professor, as an administrator, but also as a researcher in the arts, is how art can contribute to tackle what we call now the wicked problems. I don't know if you know that term, but all of these problems that can't be solved from just one discipline or perspectives, like climate change and systemic racism, poverty, social exclusion. So that's art has been actually my way to approach all of these fields, and training students and working with professors who work in the arts has also, as I understood it, been a way to contribute to society in a greater way.
If I can follow up on some of your comments, Annie, of support, because we have a question coming in from Gary Schwartz, who's interested in how that would continue in the performing arts departments. Gary points out the theater, dance, and music are particular areas of interest that he'd like to hear about with some of these interests that you've mentioned.
Well, there's a lot of really interesting research that's done in theater and in dance right now that has to do with social inclusion, for example, or working with populations at risk. I think of colleagues at UQAM, but also at Concordia, who have been working with what they call non-dancers through dance, to help them relate to their body differently or regain motor skills. So people who have physical traumas, for example, or children. So that's been kind of interesting. With theater, that's also a very, very interesting question. Theater has been a very canonical discipline, and it's starting to break the walls. I mean, it has been doing it for years, but more and more in terms of culture, in terms of bringing different voices to be heard by larger communities. And so I'm thinking about women's voices, I'm thinking about immigrant voices. That's been very important in cinema as well. But also because dance, theater, and cinema are, let's say, sport activity or team activities, team sports. There's some real interesting opportunities there to kind of rethink the way that people work and relate together, and to build actually communities that extend far beyond the classroom and far beyond the years that a BA or an MA can take.
Thank you for that, Annie. I'd like to go to you, Rebecca, and to give you a chance to come in on the earlier conversation point about why the arts. But if you don't mind, I'd like to couple that question with some of the comments coming in from a couple of students about why the arts and the time of COVID-19. Arian Weeks is asking, how can we offer support and materials? I would suggest also, space and access to studio-based programs in an unknown fall semester. This, I know you will no longer be dean at this point, but perhaps reflecting on some of the pivots that you help facilitate in March and April would bear some context on that, and the dean's role or leadership roles in institutions that facilitate a student experience on campus. This curiosity comes from Max Holzberg.
Okay, well, hi, Gary, Arian, and Max. It's nice to know that you're out there. I'm seeing all of your faces in my mind right now and trying to channel each of you. Trying to knit together these things about why the arts for me, and then you know how I can segue into what now and within the fall. So maybe I can just start by saying why the arts. I actually like spending time with artists. That's how I got into the arts. It wasn't an academic arrangement at all, and I'm very much like Annie. I've had a very serpentining, circuitous route, both into arts and culture and into academe. But so what I mean by that is, when I was younger, my dad was an actor for most of my life, and then he only later became a theater prof. And so my growing up years were really spent in a bunch of green rooms. I mean, I would be babysat by actors who were hanging out, smoking cigarettes, and drinking wine between shifts. So I think that my early introduction to the arts was being with these incredibly resilient, funny, marvelous, chameleonic, shape-shifting, wise people. And they happen to be in the theater, but these are the kinds of traits that I've seen in all of the colleagues and friends and companions that I've had for many decades. So I think if that can be the segue into, how do we deal with an unknown fall? How do we deal with an unknown future that may extend beyond the fall? I mean, Annie will certainly have some really brilliant practical ideas and approaches that she and the team in the dean's office and all of the students will work on together with the faculty members. But I think at base, what we all need to remember is we have a lot of this inside of us already, each of us. And I think this is something that people in the arts and the cultural sectors and the cultural sphere have, that's kind of like a toolbox that many other folks don't have. And I think that we not only need to think about how we can connect with ourselves and connect with others, but help others figure out how to live in these uncertain times. So part of it is about adopting a kind of selflessness and actually using and extending and sharing so many of the approaches and mindsets and philosophies and skills and tools and technologies that we have, and giving those to others. I think that's where many of us will actually find our deepest satisfaction in the next few months.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that giant 3, 4, 5-part question I delivered to you. I wonder if I can pull on the last comments that you made about our capacities to explore this together and to share, to model, to suggest from our creative positions. With a question from Miriam Cummings. She writes, hi there. She has a question specifically about working with the fine arts and some of the platforms that you've been engaging with. I'm paraphrasing a bit on her words here. But she asks, what ideas have captured your imagination in terms of engaging our artistic practices through the university online? Perhaps we can start with you, Rebecca, because your comments were getting to this germination of beautiful things happening.
Yeah, hey Miriam, that's such a great question. Well, I'm sorry, I'm speaking in anecdotes and stories a lot today. I hope you'll forgive me. It's one way, as Annie was saying, to ground ourselves. I'm finding so much of the discussions these days being very, I don't know, ethereal. So I'm trying to think through things and think through stories. So one of the stories that's very recent is the CTL, which many of you have engaged with, the Center for Teaching and Learning. If you're a faculty member, you'll know it well right now because they're giving enormous support to all of us to try to figure things out. They and IITS, which is the kind of technical service at the university, have been asking us, desperately, like, what platforms do you need? What kind of technology do you need? What kind of training do you need? What do we need to go forward? And we in fine arts have to keep saying to our lovely colleagues that we're not just looking at these platforms to deliver curriculum. We actually want to learn how to make and break platforms as art forms unto themselves. So the question is, what's been most inspiring recently? A friend and colleague, Kate Jarbo, has been sending us some amazing links to video artists that are and musicians who are using Zoom in ways that you can never imagine to create music videos online. Just yesterday, I was looking at the Guggenheim Art in Progress works, and they're commissioning under 5-minute dance performances that are really using the online platform in ways that are astonishing. Small Works Theater with Mark Sussman has been doing some amazing work. So I think what I would say is the most interesting things that are happening are, again, not happening in educational institutions. They're happening with artists. So let's see how the artists are making and breaking these platforms, because that, to me, should be our assignment for the next few months. Yeah.
Annie, would you like to add to that?
I would agree. Yeah, I was just jumping in. I would agree with what Rebecca has said. I've seen in my context some treasures of innovation, and what's been kind of interesting is that it's forced all of us. It's forced the artists. It's forced everybody else also, though, to be reflexive about our own practices and what it is we're actually trying to do. And, as a professor, we have our style, we have kind of our shtick going on, and we deliver material, and people recognize the way that we move and we think and we embody the space. But now all of a sudden, doing it via Zoom or other formats, we're kind of having to really, really think back and peel back all of that dressing and figuring out, what am I really, really, really trying to say? What are my true objectives with all of this? And I think it's the same thing for artists. Artists more and more are working across media. I don't think we're in a world anymore where sculptors only sculpt and video makers only make videos, and you have poets doing film and a lot of collaborations, and so I think that this actually is a moment where artists are going back to their basic instincts and trying to figure out what is really, really important to say and how to reconstruct that through whatever materials are available at this particular time.
You mentioned, Annie, this idea of working across, of dexterities. Sometimes that can feel like code switching as we're learning common languages or sharing practices and vocabularies. And this relates to a question for you, Annie, that's coming through from Eunice Belledor, the director at FOFA. She asks, can you please talk about being a Francophone in an Anglophone university in Montreal and how this can inform your work as Dean?
That's an interesting question. Well, I'm kind of an off again and on again Francophone, I guess, because I grew up in Montreal and studied in Montreal, but then my first few jobs were in English. I did my MA at York, my PhD in England. I started my career in Saskatchewan before I moved to Toronto. I lived in Russia. I taught in South Korea for a while. So I'm kind of used to living in translations. And I appreciate it because I know I've experienced it by trying to think thoughts and processes in different languages. You actually come up with different solutions because the frames of references are different. And so I think that this is a kind of gymnastics that I'm used to, and that is one of my strengths, that I can actually look at a problem and flip it in many different ways and think about how certain problems or ideas are thought about in the French context, in the Russian context, in other contexts. So I'm not daunted by being a Francophone in an English language university. And I think that being bilingual in Montreal is actually a really, really, really great way to tap in to a lot of the resources, and by resources, I mean people, to tap into a lot of the communities that the city has to offer.
Speaking of people, we have an attendee who would like to join the panel and ask their question. So we're going to welcome Charlie Lesser-Bercher to pose their question. Thank you for coming live with us. It's wonderful to be sharing this capacity of question asker. So as the tech enables you to join us, we'll ask you to unmute your mic and take it away.
That was.
Can you hear us, Charlie?
Charlie? Yes, but that was actually a mistake. I hit accidentally the raise hand thing. I did not mean. I'm so sorry. I wasn't paying attention to where my mouse went. Yeah,
That's
please
right.
ignore.
You could come up with a great question though, Charlie.
Oh no, please don't put me on the spot.
Okay.
Well, thank you for joining us. And also, I mean, when we're using Zoom as this interface, it's nice that there can be these sort of moments that are like being in a real life office. So I feel like this is the equivalent of maybe perhaps, Charlie, you were looking for a room and you walked in on a meeting in progress and could say hello and then duck out of the room. So it was nice to chat with you, albeit briefly, Charlie. Thank you.
Maybe actually, Maya, that might be a good segue, because many of you might know that Charlie works with the VCR, which is the Visual Collections Repository. Yep. And one of the things that I'm really interested in hearing Annie think about with us is, I mean, she's leaving this incredible institution of UQAM that has so many resources and so many amazing projects and things that have happened and are happening. I can't wait to see what she does with all the toys at Concordia. One of the many beautiful resources is this Visual Collections Repository. Concordia, as some of you might know, has one of the largest collections of still and moving images in Canada. And VCR Functions has this amazing portal into all of this material that is used in particular by especially the cinema school and the art history department, but really VCR came about as an amalgamated resource so that it can be opened up to everybody in fine arts and beyond. So I think Charlie's appearance made me think about VCR as being one of the great things that has happened over the past 5 years, and so many other really extraordinary projects that have come to life and have come to fruition. And I know I'm interested in hearing Annie talk about what she's excited about in terms of coming to Concordia and what she can work with.
That is a tough question. There's so much. I've been following from across downtown what Concordia has been doing for several years, and I have a lot of colleagues in the faculty who have told me about some of your great initiatives. You and I, Rebecca, have had drinks a few times to talk about these things. I think what I'm really excited about right now is working with the faculty. I know you have a few really exciting new hires. I think there might still be an embargo, so I'm not going to name names. But to me, that's very exciting. I really like, one of the things that I really like, and you mentioned it earlier, is the way that the faculty has started to open its spaces. Walking in the EV building and seeing students working in these public spaces and sharing, and administrators stopping by and faculty mixing in. It's a really creative environment. So I'm really excited about that. The other thing that I'm really excited about, and that's something that I was also setting up at UQAM and working towards, is all of the amazing partnerships with the community. So we had our own partners. Concordia has been working with Bâtiment 7 and the city and various community groups. I think that that is really exciting. This is something that I'm very excited about.
I'm seeing from the questions that are coming through, there is a lot of curiosity around continuity of programs that have appeared or grown or shifted during Rebecca's tenure as dean, and how you are thinking about continuing some of these and starting your own. And as we're getting towards the last 5 minutes of our time together, at least in this conversation, I'd like to bring forward a question for Rebecca. This has come from Jose Garcia via email. Jose writes, first, thank you for all the great work that you have done at Concordia. What are the biggest changes that you saw develop while you worked at Concordia as dean? You're going to continue to work with us in the art history department. And Jose continues also, we maybe share a heartwarming moment with us. Thank you again.
Oh, that's so sweet. And that's very Jose to have asked those very generous questions. Wow, the biggest changes, this is a change that I heard come to us, and I mean by us, the deans. I have heard over the past few years that the group of deans in the John Molson Business School, in Arts and Science, in what is now the Gina Cody School in Fine Arts, and I would also include in that the School of Graduate Studies, as well as the library, because Guylaine Baudry is a head librarian, but she's also like a dean. That we heard from many people that it was the most lively and collaborative group of deans that many people had seen at Concordia ever, is what I heard. And I think that in some ways it's a trick of fate and luck and timing that we were all brought together at the same time. But I also think that it says something about where Concordia has come in the last many years, that people who have a kind of openness and excitement are attracted to, as Annie said, come into these administrative jobs, because you lose a lot of sleep, but it's really exciting. And so that's one big wonderful thing that I think has happened. I think the other thing that I hope will continue to happen is this continuation of the opening of space. And I mean that in a literal fashion, that the 10-year space plan, which worked with a number of students and all the faculty members, hang on, sorry, is really, it means that the Faculty of Fine Arts is poised to, in the next few years, I think, come up with some really, really interesting architectural solutions that will accommodate a lot of the work that we're talking about, whether that's collaborative work, that's social activity, that's opening up to the street, that's cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary activity, all of that, I think is about to open up in ways that we can't even predict, but that are very exciting to imagine.
On this token of opening, and perhaps I can extend that to a position of generosity and cross-pollinating ideas. Annie, there have been a few questions coming through related to what you were already speaking of what you're excited about, what you hope to dig your teeth into when you, as Dean. But there's some questions specifically related to interests in working with the sciences, of interdisciplinarity. There's a question from Bettina Forget, for example, who asks about the continuity of some of these transmissions that have started and grown under Rebecca's tenure, and how you might approach in building and continuing to strengthen connections, not only within the Faculty of Fine Arts, but cross-faculty collaborations.
That's a really good question. As we've both said before, Rebecca and I have known each other for years now, and we've been collaborating for a few years. And so one of the things that is very, very clear to me is that we have similar understandings of the role of art in community, the importance of the Faculty of Arts in the whole Concordia ecosystem, and so partnerships with sciences for sure, but also the role of the faculty in Montreal. So the core values that we share are going to be guiding principles for sure. What will be probably different, and that comes to your questions, are the networks that we have that are different. And so I'm hoping that I'll be able to benefit from the networks that Rebecca has built, and certainly use the projects as a platform, but I'll be able to actually bring some of my own expertise and some of my networks with different organizations and different people. I've mentioned it before. My specific interest in the art lies in how it actually collaborates and functions in social processes and in this kind of solving of wicked problems, and as a way to apprehend the world, but also to impact it and to transform it. And so for me, collaborations with science, collaborations with humanities and social science and AI and within the university, but also outside the university, is really, really interesting. So that's actually one of my big motivations to being a dean, and to being a dean at Concordia, is to be able to actually step out of my own box as art historian and help people, help artists, students, faculty, and staff to meet people and to have the ability, the resources to do these really, really amazing projects that are difficult to do on your own or without the backing of an institution.
Well, we are now at 1:30, and with these large and expansive and exciting comments, it's difficult to find a way to wind this down. So perhaps we'll think of this as the first of many iterations of continuing conversation, of check-ins with our learning community, of check-ins with both of you, Annie and Rebecca. Annie, I will say that there has been a comment from Mark Corwin, our chair of the music department, who has also spied the accordion in the background of your screen. As a side note, some of our pre-live chats involved trying to form some kind of band, and Annie has said that maybe at some point she will play her accordion for us, and that would be a really nice outro, perhaps. And this is me trying to play the air accordion. But thank you, Annie, for joining us and telling us a little bit about you know, your future plans, where you're at, and how you're feeling as you step into the role as dean. And I want to thank Rebecca for the hard work and labor and attention and generosity you've brought the position over the past 5 years. I know, speaking for myself, I joined the faculty at Concordia under your tenure, and I can't imagine having done so under anybody else's leadership. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with you and to get to know you. I continue to be able to work with you. And whilst I have been the filling of the Dean sandwich, I don't want to end with my face on the screen and my remarks. So I would like to invite Annie to say something to all of you attending. Thank you again for coming. And then perhaps we can give Rebecca the last word.
I will be brief, actually. I think that this is Rebecca's moment to speak to all of you. She's done amazing work for the last few years. I mean, for me, it's been a privilege to meet her and to work with her. And it's also going to be a privilege to continue her absolutely wonderful work. I'll leave it to you, Rebecca.
Oh my gosh, well, the real person who's going to have the last word will be our lovely host, Anna Wachlebeck. But first, I want to thank Maya hugely. This is, stick handling a webinar. If any of you have done the back room stuff, it's not easy. So thank you so much, Maya. You are extraordinary. I don't have any closing words, but I think what I'll do is, Jose had kindly asked about a heartwarming moment. There have been probably 1,000, and most of you who know me will know that I cry very easily, and I have lost it on many occasions when I have been with all of you. But one image that is just seared in my brain was a few years ago. Peter Schumann from Bread and Puppet Theater received an honorary doctorate from us. And behind the scenes, all of the people who run graduation were so nervous because Peter had said, I'm bringing my fiddle, I am playing my fiddle. And everyone was like, oh no, how are we gonna do this? Like, what is he gonna do at the podium? And, it was a classic moment. And everybody in fine arts, of course, was just, nodding our heads. We couldn't wait to see what was gonna happen. And sure enough, if any of you know Peter, he's like this beautiful old, wise figure, and he's got this presence, and he brings his fiddle, stands out in the middle of the stage, I don't know, like kicks aside the podium, and he just starts nailing it on this fiddle and belting out to all the Place des Arts. And it was so, I'm getting goosebumps now, even just remembering it. And it's the first time in the 5 years that I was on that stage, many times graduating our incredible students, that everybody leapt to their feet and gave him a standing ovation. And I think, just that image to me says so much about the power and the surprise and just like the visceral, searing noise that we can make. And so I just want to keep on making that with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all so much on behalf of Fourth Space for being here, for your thoughtful comments, for your ideas, and thanks for sticking around a few extra minutes. All of those of you who are attending as well, before you go, if we could just borrow 1 more minute of your time, literally 1 minute, to invite you to answer the survey that I've pasted in the chat that'll also appear as you leave the webinar. We'd love to hear from you and get your feedback. Thanks. Fourth Space is a university-wide platform. We work collaboratively across disciplines to create this kind of programming that fosters knowledge sharing, essentially, while pushing, hopefully, new ideas and challenging ideas forward. So please do check us out. Check out our programming at CU Fourth Space and access the video archives of past events like today's that we've been recently doing at concordia.ca/4. On that note, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks again to our panelists and moderator, expertly done, and we see you again soon on this channel. Bye.